Welcome back to A Numbers Game with Ryan Girdusky. Thank you guys for being here. It is December 8th, 2025, just 17 days till Christmas. I hope you are all having a very healthy and happy holiday season and getting prepared for whatever holiday you're celebrating. I have done zero Christmas shopping whatsoever so far, so I'll be in a full-blown panic by next week. Anyway, before I get into the topic of the day, I want to talk to the young men who are listening or to parents who have young sons or nephews and they're looking for a job and a place. It is a very rough time in America to sit there and find a job, especially for a young person. I talk to young people all the time. I came across a story over my feed and I was flabbergasted by it. And I wanted to sit there and share it with you guys. The U.S. is facing a shortage of merchant marines. Now, what is a merchant marine? They're civilians who operate commercial ships, transporting cargo and passengers globally, handling navigation, maintenance, and providing services crucial for trade and military support. The government is desperate to find new merchant marines. According to the New York Times, only 810 people graduated with Coastal Guard qualifications to work on vessels last year. You may say, Ryan, I never thought about this. Why would I want this job? Salaries are well into the six figures for the Military Sealift Command, which was taken out of regular service last year because of the lack of civilians to work on these boats. The salary was $220,000 a year for first officers, along with a $71,000 signing bonus and 6 months of paid leave offshore. Now, it is tough work when you're on the boat. It's a lot of long hours, tough days, but 6 months, paid leave, $200,000 a year. I think for a lot of young men who are sitting there or maybe listening to the show, or you're a mom or a dad and you're like, what could my kid do? I just think that this might be a good way just to give it a shot. Look at this, especially if you're young and you want something to start in the economy where you can provide for a family, buy a house one day. I thought I would share because I know a lot of people out there are really confused and are looking for something. And hey, 200 grand a year, not a bad job. So anyway, let's get to politics now. So a story broke back on November 19th by City Journal. The writers Christopher Rufo and Ryan Thorpe wrote a story about Somalians living in Minnesota. Dozens of Somalians created a $1 billion plus welfare fraud scheme, one of the largest in the nation's history, and millions of these dollars ended up in the hands of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab back in Somalia. Now, if you guys remember your history, Minnesotans in Somalia had one of the largest recruiting groups in the entire country who were trying to join ISIS back in 2011 to 2016. The story got moderate play when it was broken by City Journal and Manhattan Institute. But by the New York Times got a hold of the story, it received widespread attention. According to the Times, quote, over the last 5 years, law enforcement officials say fraud took root in pockets of Minnesota's Somalian diaspora as scores of individuals made fortunes by setting up companies that build state agencies for millions of dollars worth of social services that were never provided, end quote. Now, this story comes just a year after it turned out that the Somalian community in Minnesota had another widespread fraud case back during COVID, where they were receiving federal funds to feed hungry children. And it turned out that none of the children even existed. The money was completely being stolen. One of those ringleaders was a woman named Ayun Akbar, who received the quote, Refugee of the Year award from Tim Walz, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, Kamala Harris's former running mate. Yes, Minnesota has so many refugees, and they need to constantly promote this idea of how wonderful they are. They give a Refugee of the Year award. Then, of course, this story not only came out, but we had the shooting of the National Guardsman by the Afghan National in D.C., and what followed was Trump's immigration moratorium for more than a dozen countries, including Somalia. Trump, being Trump, used some spicy language about Somalians. He said, quote, Somalia stinks and we don't want them in our country, end quote. Now, this led to Governor Tim Walz saying how wonderful the Somalis were in Minnesota, how they're pillars of the community. One local reporter was weeping on camera, basically, reading the statement out loud. The New York Times has published op-eds talking about how, white Westerners who are multi-generational Minnesotans look up to the Somalian communities as real beacons of pride, that they are part of their community. KSTP, which is a Minnesota news website, wrote a piece called Somali Minnesotans Generate at least $500 million in income annually and pay about $67 million in state and local taxes. Well, this is why people hate the media. There are 54,000 Somali adults living in Minnesota. That means the average Somali adult makes $9,000 a year, according to what you're putting out there. Of course, that would be true. Only a third of Somalians in Minnesota are not even working. So it's probably close to $20,000 a year of those who are actually even in the labor participation force. And that means about per person, they're paying $1,250 in taxes per year. Somalian immigrants send $300 million a year back to Somalia. So they're sending 5 times more money to Somalia than they are to the tax coffers in Minnesota. And that's considered a fair trade to the liberal media. They stole more money from the federal government in the last few years than they will contribute over the next decade in local and state taxes. These people are idiots. Part of me sits there and says they don't know what they're writing about, but I genuinely think that they write this in a way to make sure that the general public doesn't know how bad certain pockets and populations are when it comes to contributing to the overall national wealth and GDP, not only just GDP, but GDP per capita, the wealth of the country, the tax dollars, how many per capita join the military. All of these indicators, they're lying. They're completely lying. And the fact that any dysphoria in our country is contributing more to a foreign government than to our own local and state speaks volumes. This is why people hate the media. They gin up the story to build sympathy when anyone with a brain cell can do a calculation and say, wow, that's crazy. An impoverished group of people. Why do we import so many of them? And that's what our immigration system does. They regularly imports poverty. So naturally, as it is the case that whenever anyone criticizes anything to do with immigration, any group within immigrants, liberals have to sit there and scream from the rooftops, we are a nation of immigrants. We can't survive without immigrants. Immigrants built this country. And all the slogans from the 70s and 80s that only a population that truly incapable of actually thinking about what they're saying would actually utter out loud. They try to make people, especially college educated people, ironically, feel that the most patriotic thing that they could do is import millions of third worlders with no link to this country and then insist that they built it over the success of ancestors that have been here for generations. And the worst part of this ritualistic practice where people whose ancestors are responsible for 75% of all the technological and medical advancements of the entire world is that, they're comparing them to people who never built a railroad system. I mean, that's the truth. When you look at most of what Somalia not only has contributed to the world, but Somalia's own interior construction, their own bridges and tunnels and rail stations, the one I think that they have is most of them were built by the Italians in the 90s. Very little was actually contributed, or the Chinese recently. But aside from the Chinese and the Italians, not much was contributed actually by Somalians to build their own country. And yet they claim they built ours, of course. Well, here's the thing about immigrants. Immigrants are not a bag of oranges, right? You don't have to take them all because you want one or two. Some immigrant groups do incredibly well in this country. They're prosperous. They have low crime rates. They add into some needed fields like medicine and technology. And then others do not. When so often you sit there and you hear about immigrants founding billion-dollar businesses. Do you know how few countries those immigrants come from? 25 immigrants from Israel have gone on to found $1 billion business in the US. 21 from China, 18 from Ukraine, 17 from Canada. Anyone want to guess how many immigrants from Somalia founded $1 billion business in the US? What about Mexican immigrants? Let's take a huge population, the largest actually of any immigrant group. How many Mexican immigrants do you think founded $1 billion business in the US? What about all of Central America, whole region? The answer for that question is actually 2. And both of them were Taiwanese immigrants whose parents moved to Guatemala before moving to the United States. But they were both Taiwanese ethnics. So despite the U.S. taking in over 15 million people from Mexico and Central America, none, aside from those 2 Taiwanese immigrants, have founded $1 billion business in the U.S. 1 out of every 6,000 immigrants from Israel has founded $1 billion business. You have a better chance of getting struck by lightning twice than you do of having Mexican and Central American immigrants in this country founding billion-dollar unicorn businesses. And yet we insist that we must take in endless supplies because they could do anything, even though there's no evidence that they will. Going back to Somalians, the average Somali immigrant has a net lifetime fiscal impact of negative $300,000 per immigrant. A Somali refugee, not legal immigrant, but refugee, is negative $400,000 over the course of their lifetime. And even when you get to second generation, the net positive impact is about $100,000. So you need 2 to 3 generations to pay for the first generation of immigrants and 3 to 4 generations to pay for the refugee. Does that make any sense? Somali immigrants also have one of the highest crime rates in the United States. According to the American Community Survey, Somali immigrants have a higher incarceration rate than any class of illegal immigrants, legal immigrants, and every race and ethnicity in America aside from American blacks, who have one of the highest incarceration rates in the entire world. And according to the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, over the course of 2 decades, from 2000 to 2018, despite intense amount of financial, both private and public resources to help build and grow the Somali community in Minnesota, Somalian median household income went from $22,000 a year in the year 2000. This is household income, $22,000 a year in 2000 to $25,000 a year in 2018. And that's with an increasing workforce participation. High school graduations went from 54% to 57%, with billions being spent to encourage them to stay in high school, not college, high school. And the poverty rate still looms close to 50%, although it is down from 63% in the year 2000. So once again, why are we not allowed to talk about immigrant groups accurately? Why are we not allowed to lay out the numbers and say, here's where immigrant groups perform on crime, welfare dependency, poverty, education, social mobility, social capital? This is not a net benefit to our country. Even if a few occasionally open up a decent ethnic restaurant, that does not justify bringing in tens of thousands of people. And by keeping Americans in the dark on the actual statistics, lumping all immigrants into the same quote unquote bag of oranges that I alluded to earlier, it allows the American taxpayer to be ripped off by these groups that have no reason to be in our country. It lumps the most successful immigrants with the least successful and says, you must take all of them. There is absolutely no difference. And if you see a difference, it is a racial issue for you. Let's have an honest discussion based on the data. This is not about hating Somalians. I don't hate Somalians. I don't think I know a Somalian, but I love America. And Minnesota was once one of the highest, social trust states in the country. It was a thriving, state. It was the state that, Rose from the Golden Girls came from, where it was Norwegian. They had a social welfare program that had high levels of trust and enormous people paying into the system that they had done back in Scandinavia, back when their parents and grandparents had come to the state. It is being abused and ripped off, and that culture that built those systems will fall apart because no one trusts each other, because you have brought in communities of people with immense low social trust that sit there and use the system to scam Americans. Importing tens of thousands of Somalians was not the smartest move. And only now can we sit there and have a conversation and say, one, how do we deal with those here who shouldn't be here, who probably scammed to even get in the country? And two, like maybe member of Congress who married her own brother. And two, how do we sit there and work to make sure that this does not happen with future immigrant groups? Because there's a lot more of them that have not yet made it to the United States that would love to get here. Up next with me on this podcast is the man who broke that story on the Somalian welfare fraud. That's coming up. Stay tuned. Ryan Thorpe is an investigative journalist at the Manhattan Institute and the man who helped break the story on the Somalian refugees and the massive welfare fraud. Ryan, thank you for being on.
It's a pleasure to join.
So now, Ryan, for those who just read, it's very funny a lot of times in conservative media because we'll break a story and then the New York Times will follow 3 weeks later and they get more attention. But for those who just followed like the New York Times story, they may not have known exactly how this worked. How did these dozens of Somalian refugees, use the system to steal, $1 billion, more than $1 billion?
Yeah, what I would say about the fraud rings that have been exposed to date is they kind of followed a fairly similar script. So they were targeting a range of government welfare programs in the state. These programs almost seem specifically designed in order to facilitate fraud in some ways. We're talking about very low barriers for reimbursements or to get access to the funds in the first place. They were simply, inflating costs, saying that they were providing services that they had no intention of ever providing. And then what we saw was a real kind of perfect storm of conditions in the state of Minnesota that allowed this to go on for so long. So you had a very insular kind of clan-based tribal Somali community in the state. You had some of the most generous welfare programs in the country. You had a progressive political class that was kind of terrified of pointing out what was going on and fearful of being accused of racism. And the Somalis are also a sizable voting bloc in that state as well. So there are real political calculations at play here that allowed this situation to get so bad.
I think that's such a key. Well, I mean, that was a really easy and thorough breakdown, but that's such a key thing of a key component of the fear of both political correctness and political retribution that has really enabled. I mean, it's very true in the Somali community, but it's also true in other communities in this country, in pockets where small demographics have huge weights and voting and other things. How much of a role do you think that Tim Walz personally played in both enabling the situation and really kind of crushing down any kind of dissent against the Somalian community?
Well, what I would point to is that there are whistleblowers within the state government in Minnesota who work at DHS, and they've been trying to raise alarm bells both internally and externally for quite some time. And, these are hundreds of employees who have seen from the inside what is going on and have tried to, do what's right and to put a stop to it. And they really point to Tim Walz as the individual who's primarily responsible here. They have signaled that they're fearful of retribution, and we've also seen official reports that have been released that have pointed to a number of failures of the Waltz government. So I mean, he's the governor. In some sense, the buck stops with him. We're talking about more than $1 billion that has been defrauded from taxpayers under his watch in a handful of years here. Responsibility is somewhat inescapable for him.
And I think it's important to remember it wasn't over a billion over 20 years or a billion over a decade even. It was a billion over a very, very short period of time. And a state that's not, I mean, Minnesota's not a small state, but it's not Texas. It's not California or Florida or New York. It's not this giant monolith of a state. It is a reasonably small state when it comes to this. What the reaction to this story is interesting because it follows, and I don't know if you have, I'm sure you have heard about it, but the Somalian case with food and welfare payments for food for children during COVID. Are you aware of that story?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that was kind of, I think, the first large scale fraud ring that authorities recognized like this is a huge problem. And then since then, we've seen other fraud rings that have followed a very similar script.
Yeah, so in that case, a bunch of dozens, I think 59 Somalians was the exact number, were saying that they were paying for food during COVID with COVID welfare payments towards hungry children, and the children didn't exist, the food program didn't exist, they were just banking on everything. And one of the women who were the lead, I guess, ringleaders of the entire organization actually there's an award in Minnesota called Refugee of the Year Award. Are you aware of that?
I have
And
heard this.
the woman who got the award that like the year prior was the one who were the ringleader of this program to rob taxpayers. This isn't just a Somalian issue, obviously, where you see rings of this, but it seems like it's an ethnic enclave issue where you have very, very specific groups of people who are not assimilated into a broader culture and really have immense voting power. In Somalia, I think it's 56,000 or 58,000 registered to vote in that state specifically, and that's immense when it's not a terribly big state. What do you think that this opens the door for further investigations into that specific community, especially considering we've seen two in 1 year?
Certainly. I mean, what prosecutors have made quite clear is like we're scratching the surface in terms of the true scope of this fraud. So I'm quite comfortable saying that, we're talking about billions of dollars here, but in terms of the total dollar figure, like that still remains unclear at this point. The US Attorney's Office has been doing great work in that state, but I think that they were undermanned as well in terms of having enough resources to dedicate to this problem given the sheer scope that we're talking about. I think that there's more to learn in terms of the true scope of the fraud. And then I think there's some serious questions about state authorities. What did they do? When did they figure things out? What was the response? What was the lack of the response? So I think that those are two avenues that we need to keep digging into.
Now, I know, I mean, a lot of people who support a progressive welfare state are well intentioned. It's not like they do believe that they are helping the poorest of the poor. What could they have done different? Was it just political correctness, or was it complete malfeasance of a welfare program that wasn't capable of possibly working?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Look, we can have a policy debate on, how best do we try to help people in our communities that are struggling, certainly. And I do think that many of these programs that were defrauded, you can understand the good intentions behind them. We're talking about feeding hungry children. We're talking about trying to get autism therapy for young kids who are autistic. We're talking about trying to get like the mentally ill and people who are homeless or struggling with addiction into housing so they can try and get back on their feet, right? But with these programs, like they were designed specifically with such a low barrier to entry, such few requirements in terms of reimbursements that when I was looking at it, some of them jumped out at me. It's like, okay, if you were to design a government program to facilitate fraud, it would probably look a lot like this one in Minnesota. I also think that, look, this is a long standing problem. It also ramps up in the pandemic. So COVID hits, this thing that's been festering and kind of allowed to grow for a number of years. Well, now we got more money flying out the door than ever. We've got progressive political establishment saying like this is an emergency situation that we're in, we need to get money into the hands of people who need it, we'll figure out the details as we go. So that really allowed this problem to accelerate. I think the law enforcement sources I've spoken to have said we're playing whack-a-mole on this side of the fence, right? We're trying to wrap up these fraud rings, but there isn't a law enforcement solution here. We have to kind of go back to the drawing board from a policy standpoint and try and stem the tide of it. So even for supporters of a progressive welfare state, I think that they are going to have those conversations and think, okay, if we want to continue to fund programs of this nature, how can we do it with, a bit more program integrity?
And the craziest thing, I mean, think about this just think about this sentence, because it was true. They defrauded money for autistic children, and it ended up in the hands of a terrorist organization in Somalia that abuses children. It is, for a right-wing perspective, you could not write that any better in that kind of a headline. How much of this money, of American tax dollar money, ended up in the hands of terrorists? Do we even know?
It's very difficult to say. So a couple of things that I think are really important to highlight on this. There was some confusion about the claim that we made in our article. I thought we were quite clear, but some people seem confused. So we weren't alleging that these fraud rings had specifically targeted government programs, defrauded them for the express purpose of fundraising for Al-Shabaab. It was
Yeah.
more inadvertent than that. So we know that millions of dollars have been sent back. It's been sent abroad. They've gone through Hawala networks. They've landed in Somalia, in areas of that country where Al-Shabaab is in control. Everyone I've spoken to, from FBI to different criminal investigators who have looked at this, serious people who are well placed and have a certain degree of expertise here, they have indicated that absolutely Al-Shabaab is getting a cut of this money as it's moving through their territory. So that is the mechanism by which stolen tax dollars have ended up in their coffers. In terms of putting a true dollar figure on it, that remains up in the air. And the investigators I speak to say it is incredibly difficult to track this money because it doesn't operate the same way that a traditional kind of Western banking sector were. So almost by design, it becomes nearly impossible to try and figure out, okay, just how much are we talking about here? But, whether or not it's millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, look, the fact that it's happening at all is a serious problem. And we need to figure out how to make sure that that stops.
Well, one And this is kind of my last question. How, I mean, when I did the story on the Lincoln Project, it was kind of ignored till the New York Times did, and then all of a sudden it was basically destroyed the entire organization. You guys broke the story out, and it was you and Chris Rufo, and immediately it was right wingers saying this thing, and then the New York Times said it, and then all of a sudden it was serious. What has the reaction from Democrats been? Because now they're saying it's just about Trump and him being anti-immigrant, but this is a true issue. And has Tim Walz said he's going to reform all these welfare programs?
Well, I know that funding for a number of programs has stopped, but I think we've seen high profile Democrats attempt to deflect. So, one, yes, people will simply point to Trump, some of the comments that he's made, and try and make that the central focus. We've also seen, accusations of racism, essentially directed towards myself and my co-author, Christopher Rufo. I mean, look, people can say what they want. The first question is it true? Like, we have to follow the facts where they lead, and we have to confront them as they are, not how we would like them to be. And the facts in this case are that it is true. It's happening. So I would think among more serious-minded Democrats, they realize, hey, we have a serious problem on our hands, and we're going to have to do something about it. But there's been a lot of deflection to date.
Yeah, and it's so fun. Have you ever heard of the Killer King Hospital in Los Angeles? You ever hear the story? It
I
was a
haven't.
hospital in LA that was, I mean, people would go in for a fender bender and like end up being killed by the hospital staff. They were hiring criminals who were selling like peanuts and popcorn in the hallways of the hospital. It was insane. And every time this hospital came up for an investigation and it was reported the intense amounts of malfeasance, Maxine Waters would say, "You're all racist for sitting there and claiming that this is a huge problem." They always use racism as a deflection for mass corruption in various pockets of this country. But it is so important to say it when it's there, because it destroys social trust, especially in a state like Minnesota, which historically had huge levels of social trust. Not as much anymore. Ryan, where can people go to read more of your work and what you're doing coming up next? You have a lot of very interesting investigative journalist stuff.
So you can read my work at City Journal, which is city-journal.org. That's where all my work is published these days. And then you can also follow me on X at RK_Thorpe.
Your stuff at City Journal, which is run by the Manhattan Institute, so that's why I said Manhattan Institute earlier, is fantastic. Really worth reading your stuff. Thank you so much for doing this podcast, Ryan.
It was great joining you.
Now it's time for Ask Me Anything. If you want to be part of the Ask Me Anything segment, email me, Ryan@numbersgamepodcast.com. That's Ryan@numbersgamepodcast.com. I have a bunch of questions to get to before the end of the year, so I'm very excited. This question comes from Derek. He says, Ryan, loved the show. 2 quick questions. The first, on whether the border wall is actually being built. I know BBB had funds set aside, but I'm curious what the actual progress is. The second question is the state of European politics. I remember reading your article in the American Conservative last year about Giorgia Meloni and how well she's navigating the tightrope of Italian and EU politics moving forward a conservative populist agenda. Is that still the case? And is there momentum across Europe for populist anti-migrant leaders, ranging from Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage to Jordan Bardella and the AfD? Derek, great questions. First, on the border wall, DHS awarded a contract just a few weeks ago for 27 miles of new wall in Arizona. Secretary Kristi Noem has had 5 waivers signed for border wall construction to try to continue the construction of it. What it seems like to me, based upon reading what's going on in Texas, California, and Arizona, is that they're trying to finish the parts of the wall that they had the money for, that they were contracted for, that President Biden stopped construction on. So I'm seeing 27 miles over in Arizona, and I'm seeing about 100 miles between Texas and California of trying to finish those repairs. That's what I'm seeing so far. Hopefully they continue pushing forward on it, but that's what I'm seeing as far as that goes. When it comes to Giorgia Meloni, if those who didn't read the article, Italy has a very strange political system. So because they were part of, fascist Italy back in the 40s, they created a system where the president is not elected, but he's voted on by both senators and members of certain social class in Italy, but not by the people. And the president has the ability to take over the government from the prime minister. So Giorgia Meloni is the prime minister. And if the president feels like she has taken the government into a direction that is not beneficial for Italy for any purposes, he can dismiss her government, take it over, and appoint bankers or whoever he wants to fill all the roles. That's why Italy is, in part, why Italy has never managed to do a lot with their government, a lot with reforms. That is why Giorgia Meloni has not been able to do a lot on populist stuff. I will say border crossings are down substantially. She has increased legal immigration, but Italy's population is falling by unbelievable numbers, both because of Italian citizens leaving the country because it's so poor, but also because of their extraordinarily low birth rates in the country. And they've been unable to do anything about that so far. I know they tried policy proposals, but it hasn't worked. Ultimately, I would sit there and say that Giorgia Meloni is trying to pass this constitutional amendment for several years now, which would effectively neutralize the role of the president and make it incapable for the president to take out the prime minister on their own will based on, if they're quote unquote beneficial to the EU, is what they're really saying when they say beneficial to Italy. If that goes through, then the ball will be in Meloni's court to really go, ham and do whatever she wants. Italy's elections are not next year, but I think they're the year after. So she's set to probably grow her majority, and I think she's working very, very well from a tightrope. As far as other leaders go, yeah, next year only has, I think, the Portuguese presidential elections, and there's the Hungarian parliamentary elections. There's a lot of local ones, but as far as major national ones, unless someone's government collapses, which could always happen, but unless that happens, then those are the only major ones that are happening throughout Europe. But if you look at the polls in Portugal, the Chega party is polling number 1 or number 2 for president, depending on the polls. Over in France, Jordan Bardella is not only winning the first round, but the second round of the presidential elections under the National Rally, the Populist National Rally. AFD is polling in first, and Nigel Farage is polling in first as well. Although, let's see if Rupert Lowe is able to sit there and take some support away from him with his own party. But yeah, populist parties are still rising all across Europe, even in Denmark, where there is an election coming up next year. The Danish People's Party is increasing substantially. They're running on remitigation. In Sweden, the center-right and nationalist government is likely going to lose their majority just because it's very, very tight. I think they have a 3-seat majority. So it's interesting. But overall, the trajectory is very, very clear towards national populism throughout Europe. That's a great question, Derek. I really hope that I answered it. Okay, last question of the show. My name is Tristan. I live in Delray, Florida. You're incredibly based on your opinions. Thank you, Tristan. Of course, you've been talking a lot about data centers, and they're a major issue in Virginia. Living in Florida, our electricity cost is rather seasonal, high in the summer and lower in the winter. Of course, because of air conditioning. I was curious how data centers were being handled around here, and I am pleasantly surprised to see that the utility companies essentially have increased pricing structures for new loads of 15 megawatts and larger. Essentially, there's no tax breaks, and data centers are paying their full price. Would you say that Florida model is the most politically smart in terms of protecting residents? If not, is there another state that's handling it well? So this is a great question. Ron DeSantis, who is a really, phenomenal governor, just phenomenal. He really has done a lot, and he has a robust AI regulation bill called the AI Bill of Rights. A big part of it is data center proposals. It says, quote, data center proposals will protect consumers from footing the bill of AI data centers. The proposal will protect ratepayers, prohibit utilities from changing in Florida residents, more to support hyperscale data center development, protect taxpayers, no taxpayer subsidies for big tech, protect local control, protect Florida water, and protect Florida for the natural sites in Florida, I guess the waterways and the national parks and whatever. So from what I could sit there and see, I did a little bit of research. DeSantis probably, he prohibited utilities from charging customers for more electricity, gas, or water to hyperscale data center development. He is the only governor who did this, which is so smart, allowing local governments to prohibit data centers from developing and construction when it comes to sitting there and jacking up the rates for customers. I read law after law, and DeSantis is on top of this more than anybody else. As far as other states go, legislation has been proposed in California. It is yet to pass. The New York State has proposed a bill where data centers would be charged for any grid facility upgrades that they need because of the increased uses. And in Virginia, there is an energy law firm that is proposing somewhat similar, but they're just proposing studies. Basically, they're still at the study phase. So yeah, you're right. DeSantis, I actually did not know before researching that DeSantis had done so much to protect consumers on electricity prices. And he's done what seems like a phenomenal job. And he is, as usual with his entire governorship, far and away above every other governor in the country. That's what happens when you elect a very smart person. So, yep, that's what I have. You guys have it the best. I wish I could report, oh no, all these other states, they've done just as much, but it is not the truth. DeSantis is far and away ahead on the issue and ahead on the curve, which is why voting for the next governor of Florida is very, very, very important, to find somebody who can keep up what he is doing. That's the show for today. On Thursday's episode is the very fun episode. I'm having my Gen Z staff come and do pop culture, history, and news, interviews for what happened to Gen Xers and millennials. So it's millennial movies, TV, music, news stories, to see how much they know about the world that existed before them. It's going to be a lot of fun. Tune in, stay tuned, and I will see you guys on Thursday.